When understanding Bulgaria on the onset of war, one must look at the nation from an economic perspective. After their defeat in the Second Balkan War, they were sent into a brutal decline, owing 1.3 billion francs to the Ottoman Empire alone, 4 billion British pounds in today's money, and just barely avoided a famine. Territory was taken from Bulgaria, which really did not help with their recovery. They were desperately in need of money, and it just so happened that the world was looking for investment opportunities at that time. The wealthy creditor state, France, had heavily financed Russia and Serbia in return for good relations, and received a defensive alliance in Russia's case. Likewise, Germany was invested heavily into the Ottoman Empire in the hope for a similar outcome. Although in the Ottoman case, the Entente was still heavily invested into them as well, arguably explaining why they needed a little bit more convincing before they sided with the Central Powers. But there's a whole video up on that already. Bulgaria reached out to France and were more than willing to accept unfavourable terms for a quick loan. They were turned down. Then they reached out to Russia, likewise, but again were turned down. Russia was growing uneasy with Bulgaria and saw them as the counter-Russian power in the Balkans, a rival to their ally, Serbia. Bulgaria had to look elsewhere and received from Austria-Hungary 30 million francs. Nowhere near enough, but it was a start. Naturally, fears began to rise that Bulgaria could become financially reliant on Germany and Austria-Hungary. This would weaken Russia's position in the Balkans. However, the thought that really began to change Russia's mind on the matter was the fear that the money made from the loans would go into purchasing from Austria-Hungary new weapons and equipment, a stronger Bulgaria, a more industrialised Austria-Hungary, and the two working together with Germany and potentially the Ottoman Empire began to look very concerning. The Entente's plan was to surround the Central Powers. However, it seemed like Caesar at a leisure. The same could happen, but in reverse. Russia proposed a deal. A loan was offered. However, any weapons that Bulgaria was to purchase must come from France, and France alone. This was followed by a bid from Germany, which had no restrictions or clauses imposed at all. Bulgaria accepted for German funding. A major French bank did eventually arrive on the scene with a massive offer, 500 million francs at an interest rate of 5%, with Russia as the guarantee, meaning if Bulgaria failed to pay back the loans, the debt would fall on Russia. But it was too late. During the July crisis, when things were getting hot, Germany offered another massive loan to Bulgaria, however with the requirement that a port must be built along the Aegean, along with a railway connection, granting Germany influence access to the Mediterranean Sea. This was met with hostility and violence from many Bulgarians, who thought it tied them too closely to Germany, but was ultimately passed, apparently by show of hands when it came to voting. But we don't have the real voting numbers there. One of those kind of elections. The war began, but Bulgaria's position was not yet cemented. Initially, they decided to remain neutral, but began militarising the nation and investing into improving the Bulgarian army, as if secretly preparing for a war. Russia tried to bring Bulgaria in, offering that Serbia will cede some of their territories to Bulgaria to bribe them into the war, and Serbia would gain more lands in the event of victory elsewhere. Serbia refused this arrangement, as after the Second Balkan War, the two were clear rivals, with claims over each other's land. As the war dragged on, the public's interest increased, and there was a desire internally for Bulgaria to pick a side. The policy switched from neutrality to a strategy of let's wait and see who the winning side is probably going to be. The Entente offered Eastern Thrace and Kavala from Greece. This would be purchased from Greece by the Entente. A bit of Macedonia from Serbia, who in return would be granted more from Austria-Hungary, and southern Dobruja from Romania, who would, I assume, also gain financial compensation. Constantinople had already been promised to Russia. Issue was, Greece and Serbia were not part of these negotiations, and they got really angry when they found out. Bulgaria, seeing this, could not take the Entente seriously and expected to be backstabbed. At the time, the Entente were making a pushback there and looked like the power that could win, but then Gallipoli became a stalemate. Russian gains began to reverse. Italy's entry into the war had not broken the Austro-Hungarian Empire as some had expected. In the end, Germany could just provide more. In the event of victory, Germany could offer the entirety of Vardar Macedonia, guaranteed if victorious, unlike the Entente's constant beat of maybe, maybe. Even parts of Romania and Greece if they were to enter the war on the side of the Entente, recovering all the losses from the Second Balkan War and potentially more. In addition, this was followed by a promise of resources from Germany and a huge loan of 200 million francs in the event that the war lasted more than 4 months, and this was followed by yet another small loan to be granted instantly. They joined the Central Powers, and on the 14th of October 1915 declared war on Serbia. Bulgaria claims them siding with the Central Powers was based off opportunism, the Central Powers having more to offer. This makes sense, especially considering they were preparing for war since 1914, getting ready to hop in. However, it does not make sense, given that Bulgaria did often try and negotiate with the Entente, and that they started with a wait-and-see mentality. Maybe these negotiations were not serious, and they were perhaps merely trying to get Germany to bid higher. We don't know, but still it is very possible that the decision was closer than they let on. Bulgaria needed money, and the Entente could certainly provide that too. Would history have been different if France had indeed came to Bulgaria with a great loan that Germany and Austria-Hungary could not compete with before the war? Would Bulgaria have still joined the Central Powers, or would it all be enough to have tipped the scales differently? That's a question we will likely never know the answer to, really. But the fact we don't know shows that it could have happened. And the fact that a simple loan could reshape history goes to show the power that part of diplomacy played in the past. To further add to the power of the loan, the funding France gave to Russia really did help to turn the Russian economy around, so much so that many German commanders believed a successful war against Russia would not be possible by 1916 to 1917. Moltke himself described the loan as one of the most strategic blows that France has dealt us since the War of 1870 to 71. Even to this day, we still see debt trapping play out. Money plays a role in diplomacy. Look at China and their investments in Africa, and countless other examples still happening to this day. Not necessarily always with debt, but with trade rights and tariff agreements as well. Look how deeply economics shapes the geopolitical world. That is what I want to get across in this video. Check out the channel The Great War if you want to know how Bulgaria fared in the conflict. They do an excellent job at covering that field. Anyway, hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe to get notified of the next one, which will be a look into the war aims of the United States of America. And please share this video with anyone you think may be interested. It really helps me out. But for now, this has been the history of diplomacy.